When we left off yesterday, Pippi has gone round to Annika and Tommy's house. Their mother's having a coffee morning and coffee party, and basically their mother and her friends are discussing about the sort of the home helps that they have. I suppose, like sort of maids or housekeepers, and they're kind of moaning about them. And basically, Pippi is constantly chiming in with stories about her home help called Malin, and stealing things and breaking things and generally causing kind of mayhem. Anyway, she keeps butting into their conversation with with her own stories. By now, Mrs. Settigren's patience had come to an end. She ran up the stairs, into the children's room, and walked over to Pippi, who had just begun to teach Tommy to stand on his head. "You're not allowed to come here ever again," said Mrs. Settigren, "because you behave so badly." Pippi looked at her in astonishment, and then her eyes slowly filled with tears. "I might have known I couldn't behave," she said. "There's no point even trying. I can never learn anyway. I should have stayed at sea." I think this is the lovely thing about Pippi, isn't it? She genuinely doesn't sort of understand the consequences sometimes of her actions. I mean, they're delightful mostly, and she is a good person. But other people, adults, has to be noted, find her quite frustrating because there is a sort of wildness to her, isn't there? Which is a wonderful quality, actually. But yes, adults who are very kind of a bit stiff and a bit formal, and like to be in charge and like to control everything, they find her too much. Then she gave Mrs. Settigren a curtsy, said goodbye to Tommy and Annika, and went slowly down the stairs. By now the ladies were also getting ready to go home. Pippi sat on the boot shelf in the hall and looked at the ladies as they put on their hats and coats. "Such a pity you don't like your home helps," she said. "You should have one like Malin. You won't find a better maid. Granny always said. Do you know, one Christmas when Malin was going to serve a roast piglet, do you know what she said? Do you know what she did? She'd read in a cookery book that roast piglet should be served with pleated paper in the ears and an apple in the mouth. Poor Malin didn't understand it was the piglet that they were talking about. You should have seen her when she came in on Christmas Eve, wearing her apron and with a huge apple stuck in her mouth. Granny said to her, 'What a nincompoop you are, Malin.' And of course Malin couldn't get a word out to defend herself, but could only waggle her ears, which made the paper rustle. She tried to say something, but all that came out was blub, blub, blub. And of course, she couldn't bite people on the leg like she usually did, even though there were lots of visitors that day. No, it wasn't a happy Christmas Eve for little Malin, Pippi said glumly. The ladies had their coats on by now and were saying their last goodbyes to Mrs. Settigren. Pippi ran up to her and whispered, "I'm sorry I couldn't behave. Cheerio." And then she flung on her big hat and went out with the ladies. Outside the gate they went different ways, Pippi to Villa Villicula and the ladies in the opposite direction. But they'd only walked a short distance when they heard panting. It was Pippi running up behind them. You won't believe how sad Granny was to lose Malin. You see, one Tuesday morning, Malin hardly had time to break more than a dozen teacups before she ran off to sea. Granny had to smash the china herself that day. She wasn't used to it, poor thing, and it gave her blisters. After that, she never saw Malin again. Such a waste of a first-rate maid, Granny said. Then Pippi left, and the ladies hurried on their way. But they hadn't walked far before they heard her in the distance yelling at the top of her lungs, "That Malin, she never swept under the beds." There's no chapter numbers actually. So I'm always about to say, chapter 3 or chapter 4. There's no chapter numbers. This one is called Pippi Becomes a Lifesaver. I'm just going to take a drink. What am I drinking? It might be advertising, mightn't it? Advertising on YouTube. It's a special treat. I don't do this very often. Having a bottle of sugar-free Coke. Right. Pippi becomes a lifesaver. One Sunday afternoon, Pippi was thinking what to do. Tommy and Annika and their mum and dad had been invited out to sea. To sea? To tea. So she couldn't expect a visit from them. The day had been full of nice activities. She'd got up early, taken Mr. Nilsson orange squash and buns in bed. I do like orange squash, quite partial, and buns. He looked so sweet sitting there in his light blue nightshirt, holding the glass in both hands. Then she had fed and brushed the horse and told him a long story about her adventures at sea. After that, she had gone into the sitting room and painted an enormous picture on the wallpaper. It was a picture of a rather large lady in a red dress and black hat. Sorry, that's the Coke. In one hand, she was holding a flower, and in the other, a dead rat. It was a very beautiful painting, thought Pippi. Really? It brightened up the whole room. After that, she had sat at her writing bureau, office, desk, big desk, looking at all her birds' eggs and shells. And that made her think of all the places where she and her dad had collected them, and all the nice little shops all over the world where she had bought the precious things she kept in the bureau drawers. Then she had tried to teach Mr. Nilsson to dance the polka, but he didn't want to. For one moment, she had considered trying to teach the horse, but for some reason she crawled inside the log box instead and shut the lid. She played at being a sardine in a sardine tin, but it wasn't much fun without Tommy and Annika being there and pretending to be sardines as well. Have you played that game, Sardines? I love playing that game. I play it with my goddaughter and her sister. But now it was beginning to get dark. She pressed her little potato nose up against the window and looked out at the chilly autumn evening. Then she remembered that she hadn't been out riding for a few days, so she decided to do that right away. It would be a nice end to a pleasant Sunday. So she went and put on her big hat, fetched Mr. Nilsson, who was sitting in a corner playing with some marbles, saddled her horse, and lifted him down from the veranda. And off they set, Mr. Nilsson on Pippi, and Pippi on the horse. It was quite cold and the roads were icy, and there was a lot of crunching and cracking as they galloped along. Mr. Nilsson sat on Pippi's shoulder and tried to grab some of the branches of the trees, but Pippi was riding too fast. On the other hand, he received more than a few slaps around the ears from the branches as they passed, and it was hard for him to keep his straw hat on his head. Pippi rode through the little town, and people anxiously backed up against the buildings as she stormed past. Naturally, the little town had a square, with a small yellow-painted town hall, alongside a few beautiful old buildings, all of them only 1 floor high. There was an ugly great building there too, newly built and with 3 floors, known as the skyscraper because it was taller than all the other buildings in the town. At this time on a Sunday evening, the little town seemed very quiet and peaceful. But suddenly the calm was broken by a loud shout. "The skyscraper's burning! Fire, fire!" From every direction people came running, wide-eyed. A fire engine drove through the streets with its siren blaring, and all the... Sorry, let me just read that bit again. A fire engine drove through the streets with its siren blaring, and all the small children who otherwise thought it was fun to see a fire engine now cried in fright because they thought their homes would catch fire too. The square below the skyscraper was crammed full of people, and the police were trying to hold them back to let the fire engine through. Tons of flame burst from the skyscraper's windows, and smoke and sparks enveloped the firefighters who bravely tried to put out the fire. The fire had started on the ground floor, but quickly spread to the floors above. Suddenly, the onlookers in the square saw a sight that made them gasp in horror. At the very top of the building was an attic window, and in the window, that had just been opened by a tiny hand, stood 2 little boys, crying out for help. "We can't get out because someone has set fire to the stairs," shouted the bigger of the 2 boys. He was 5 years old, and his brother was 1 year younger. Their mother had popped out on an errand, and here they were all alone. Many people down below began to cry, and the fire chief looked worried. There was a ladder on the fire engine, naturally, but it wasn't nearly long enough. Going into the building to bring out the boys was impossible. A great feeling of despair settled over the people watching from the square when they realised that nothing could be done to help the children. And the poor little boy stood there in the window crying. It would only be a few minutes before the fire reached the attic. End of part 1.